Arizona. So the sun is just rising here. Very good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to share with you some of the work we're doing here in Tucson, especially around stormwater. And during this time of water scarcity, climate change, and so just kind of this uncertainty as we look forward to the future. And what my organization and others in our community are trying to do is think about, is there a different path forward that we could be thinking about and taking versus being uncertain, being fearful, and thinking about how to build big infrastructure that may not be necessary. So let's go on a little bit of a stormwater journey. I like to start as I get inspiration from the indigenous nations around us and the peoples who have managed and stewarded our waters and lands for essentially time immemorial. And just in the past 100 years, that's where we've pumped aquifers dry, we've dried up our rivers, we've paved over our floodplains. And so thinking about that inspiration of long-standing stewardship that continues to this day, and just recognizing those peoples. So this is just a quick watershed map where I am here in Tucson. So we're part of the Santa Cruz River Watershed. It's a really cool watershed in that it starts in Arizona, heads south into Mexico, makes a U-turn back into Arizona, and then flows through Tucson. And this is a river that is largely has died, but is starting to make its way coming back. And so I guess I shouldn't say it's died, but it's returning surface flows thanks to the collective work of many different organizations, agencies, and community members. And just a brief history of where we've come from to where we are now. So in the 40s and 50s, Tucson was booming. We were pumping a lot of groundwater, and up until about 1995. And you can see that we've really mined our groundwater aquifer here in the Tucson Basin. Tucson is pretty cool in that it's surrounded by mountains. So we have the Catalina Mountains, the Rincon Mountains. Down south that you can't see on this map are the Santa Rita Mountains. So there's this really large basin in between all of these mountain ranges. And that's, unfortunately, we did pump it, up to 200 feet. And since then, we have shifted our water management to being supplied from the Colorado River via the Central Arizona Project. Now, not to be confused with the Colorado River that flows through Texas, but this is the one that flows from the upper states down through the Arizona, Nevada, California border to the Gulf of, or the Sea of Cortez. And since we've shifted that water resource, we have been able to allow our aquifer to rebound quite a bit. However, this is roughly where the 71 feet of return you see. That's still recognizing that was mined over 200 foot from a drop in the aquifer level. So we still have quite a ways to go. We are making some returns on that. But now Arizona, our community is starting to look at where's that next big bucket of water. We continue to be growing at a really fast rate. We have uncertainty with the Colorado River supplies. It's being renegotiated, and it looks like Arizona is going to take a big cut. Our city council has already indicated that they would like to be part of that solution. And so we are looking at some cuts from that Colorado River that's being supplied to Tucson that will be getting cut a little bit as well. And so I want to introduce a term. I don't believe this term's in the dictionary yet, or maybe Wikipedia, but it should be. We had fun. We like to come up with fun new phrases that are a little bit catchy. And that's this term of being hydrolocal. And so this is where instead of looking for outside resources or mining extractive waters, is how can we better value and steward our local renewable water resources instead of depleting those distant rivers and watersheds. So myself, our organization, we're in the business of restoring our watershed, restoring our creeks, restoring our rivers. But how can we do that at the expense of another distant watershed? And so we've kind of shifted to look at how can we as a community be hydrolocal? And so it starts a little bit on the demand side, and we also have to turn to the supply side. So on the demand side, I have the red box outlined here where, over 100,000 acre feet is being supplied just to the municipal sector. And I'm just going to zero in on the municipal sector because the city of Tucson has a water utility that 90% of that water goes to residential use. Once we start to include the agricultural sector, things get a little bit more complicated, but we live in largely an urban basin and urban watershed. So the trick is how can we shift from our current supplies being the Central Arizona project being delivered hundreds of miles over the desert from the Colorado River and shift to being more reliant on our natural groundwater recharge, our surface flows, treated effluent, and at the very bottom, you'll see harvestable rainwater. So let's talk about that. Thinking about the supply side is we have this immense supply that's growing as we build out our communities. So the more hardscape we have, we actually produce that much more runoff. So this is called urban enhanced runoff. And interestingly, some local hydrologists have found that when you move from an undeveloped watershed, this green line at the bottom, to a developed watershed, so essentially hardening a lot of surfaces, roads, roofs, driveways, parking lots, we produce this much more stormwater runoff. And it's really efficient and effective to harvest it from the rooftop to the neighborhood scale. However, at the rooftop scale, that's largely on-site, on property. So those are individual homeowners, businesses. So that's not really accessible to the community, but thinking about it from the community scale is that what's running off that lot to what's running down that neighborhood. They estimate that we could produce up to 25,000 acre feet of additional water. This is new water to our community. So it's not appropriated downstream. We're not stealing it from anybody, but this is water that in an undeveloped watershed would have gone to plants and then evapotranspired. Now it's running off into our creeks and channels, causing erosion, flooding, and flowing downstream, and then evaporating out in the desert flats. But we can't just, 25,000 isn't going to make up 100,000 acre feet. So we also have to look at the demand side. And the demand side is currently the city of Tucson residents use on average 80 gallons per person per day. And so this is largely the makeup from toilets to faucets to outdoor use, including leaks, is what makes up that 80 gallons per person per day. I say this is wasteful. This is ridiculous that we use this much water. There are communities that use far less, and there's also communities that use far more, but let's focus on how we can be less. And so to be hydrolocal, if we look at that additional supply and then looking at where we can save water, we can easily be more efficient with toilets. So a lot of these toilets are outdated, not low flow toilets. We can be more efficient with some of our fixtures, our laundries, shower fixtures, etc. But it's largely in this outdoor sector that we have a lot of gains that we can make. And this is through passive rainwater harvesting, rain gardens, reuse of gray water, use of rain tanks, and then just shifting to native low water use plants. And with that, we can easily get down to 40 gallons per person per day. And so that's cutting our demand in half, essentially. And this is how we propose to do it, starting at home. So reuse of gray water, valuing our groundwater, so reducing, being conscious that we live in a desert and we need to act like we live in a desert. So thinking about behavior change, harvesting rainwater, so both passive and active systems, infiltrating stormwater, and where it feasible, recharging our groundwater, especially in those shallow groundwater areas. And then making sure all of this kind of drives toward stewardship. So stewarding our streets, stewarding our arroyos, stewarding our rivers. And as we scale up across the community, thinking about it from a one water framework, we're very fortunate that the city of Tucson has been a leader in thinking about being a one water utility. Is then how do we manage our effluent, our treated effluent, and how do we do that to better enhance our riparian environments, especially our rivers? How do we infiltrate stormwater collectively across the community, especially with many of these being public spaces? How do we value that groundwater? Currently, almost a third of our aquifer is contaminated from PFAS, TCEs, and other contaminants. So thinking about as we turn back to relying more on our natural recharge, we have to keep that a clean water supply. And then harvesting rainwater across our community, incentivizing and building out that infrastructure. And so my organization, Watershed Management Group, we're a nonprofit based here in Tucson. We do our work at all of these different scales with all of the different community sectors, from homes, churches, schools, and businesses, across our streets, along our arroyos, reclaiming our floodplains, and then ultimately we have a 50-year program vision to restore flow to our creeks and rivers across Tucson. So we have a heritage as a community of flowing creeks and rivers that we've lost, and thinking about how do we preserve the few remnants, and how do we re-expand that back to having flowing creeks and rivers. And so to dive a little bit more into that stormwater side, this is a problem, right? We all see nuisance flooding, chronic flooding, catastrophic flooding, and this is largely because we've lost that sponge that used to be our creeks and rivers, our arroyos that could handle this water, and now our streets are essentially our arroyos. But it's pretty simple to flip that on its head and start to think about it as a resource. And when we do that, it opens up a huge range of opportunities. And if you ever come visit us in Tucson, stop by our Living Lab and Learning Center. We are fully 100% on rainwater. In fact, I got up this morning and you can't see very well, but I have a glass of rainwater right here that I enjoy both at my house and here at our Living Lab. Our entire campus is fed from rainwater, both passive, active, reuse of gray water, and that's how we are demonstrating to be hydrolocal. We produce more water than we need. So in an average rainfall year, we only demand about 16,000 gallons and we can produce over 19,000 gallons. So where does that water go? It gets returned back to the soil. And so this is thinking about it not just as being net zero, but net positive. So as a campus, we are now a water producer instead of a water consumer. And that's partly kind of flipping that switch, is thinking about how each home, each business can be a producer versus a consumer. We just came off 2 weeks ago. We have a week-long course that we host 2 to 3 times a year. It's called our Water Harvesting Design Certification, and we dive deep into water budgeting, budgeting both the supplies, the demands, thinking about it from an integrated design perspective of if we're going to design a site, how do we do it thinking about sun angles, wind flows, human pathways, and then how do we incorporate and integrate the water harvesting systems to benefit the site? And so thinking about it from all of this, we turn it into a 6-day course. Folks go back to their communities inspired and becoming practitioners. So who knows, you may have a few certified practitioners in your own community, and asking them, like, thinking about what are the multiple benefits that we can derive from stormwater and rainwater. So I always like to start at the home, and myself, I like to walk the talk. I like to be able to learn from my own experiences. And so just to share a little bit, you may think it's a little odd, but we have a composting toilet. I hate flushing the toilet. I hate pooping inside. I love my outdoor composting toilet, and that helps me save, a gallon per flush. So I save up to 10 gallons per day. Then I have a veggie garden. I have fruit trees, all of this rainwater fed, gray water fed. I have many different chickens at my own house. I have almost an acre of land, and I'm only consuming about 10 gallons per per person per day. So with two adults, my wife and I, it's about 750 gallons per month, or 1 CCF. And in fact, I measure the rainwater that comes out of my tanks, and combined with my rainwater from the tanks and my municipal water that I use for a few indoor needs, I'm still well under that 40 gallons per person per day. And in fact, I actually accept neighborhood stormwater into my front yard. And with that, I've measured that about a half-inch rainstorm produces 1 acre-feet of stormwater infiltration in my yard. I have a sandy soil. I'm close to the Rito River, and I can have pretty good recharge potential from my front yard to that aquifer. So I'm estimating that I recharge roughly 2 to 3 acre-feet of enhanced infiltration of stormwater per year. So thinking about that, not everybody has this opportunity, but as we take advantage of more of these opportunities, we can turn our community from being a consumer into being water producers and starting to better steward our local waters. So taking it to our church, to our schools, to our community, this is Drachman Montessori. We worked with a teacher with a bunch of fourth graders, and they saw this as a problem. What I'm not showing you is the adjacent neighborhood street that had chronic flooding. This school was contributing directly to that. So the fourth graders saw this as a problem. They turned it into an opportunity. They designed, and we just facilitated the installation of a rain garden with native plants right outside their classroom. And this is now a thriving rain garden with native plants. So it doesn't require engineers to design this. I apologize for the engineers in the room. Fourth graders can do this work. So once we learn the basics, understand those principles, we can make it work pretty cost effectively. In fact, during the pandemic, we shifted to everybody, how do we steward at home? And so we built this small program concept called Build Your Own Basin. And it started during the pandemic with a virtual training, and we did social distancing based kit distributions for rain garden kits. Now we have it as a lively program where people come together. In 1 hour, they learn how to build a basin, care for a basin, and they go home with a tree, a shrub, two native plants or native grasses, a bag of mulch, and this bilingual zine so they can implement it at their own house. This is all available for free downloads on our website if you're interested. And we love working with churches. So schools and churches are really cool because community comes to them. And so it's really easy to then start to think about how we can engage community, mobilize community for change. And these sites themselves are always ripe for opportunity for implementing a different way of managing water. This is at New Hope, Nueva Esperanza Church. They had a really hot paved over parking. So we found that there was some extra space. So we were able to cut the asphalt, free the earth, and plant some trees. And now these trees this was from a couple of years ago. I just visited this site a couple of months ago. These trees are huge and starting to shade this parking lot. And so just a real easy example of how to cool our cities, combat urban heat mitigation, especially in an underserved portion of the community, and deal with some chronic flooding. The church and the neighborhood here, when we approached them, they were actually fearful every time it rained because of the flooding issues. And so that was such a eye opener for myself because I get really excited when it rains. and to hear from these folks, how concerned and how fearful they were every time it rained. But we worked with them to take advantage of a lot of opportunities on their property and around their neighborhood. Another example of how to use stormwater as a resource and also save some water. So another neighborhood up in the foothills, they wanted to enhance their public right-of-way where they had walking trail, native plant amenities. Turns out these trees were being over-irrigated and they still had a stormwater erosion problem. So we found simple opportunities to divert that water, sink it into the soil, support these trees, and then we were actually able to reduce how much water those trees were getting. A couple of neighbors started measuring how much they were saving. This is a annual consumption across all of their water meters from 2016 to 2023. You can see there's some variability, but largely a downward trend from a water use perspective. And now they're saving almost on average $3,000 per year. They're reinvesting that back to do more of these types of projects so they can get more savings each and every year. So it's a really cool way that they're self-funding their rainwater harvesting projects. Another neighborhood HOA that I'm working with and currently talking about opportunities, they have many different lakes within their community. All of these lakes are being fed from a shallow groundwater system that is taking water from a beautiful, healthy riparian environment. So we're looking at how can they reduce their water consumption? How can they become a better supporter of their adjacent riparian environment that's on the decline because of droughts. And so we started looking at what's the opportunity for converting the surface pond that you see here in this picture to becoming a recharge center. And so we found that there's a small neighborhood drainage that we could divert, capture some of the sediment and pollutants in kind of a first flush basin, and then take that, maybe even scale back the extent of this surface area and plant it as kind of a mesic riparian that then has the ability to recharge. Any excess flows could then be returned back safely to the adjacent arroyo. So these opportunities are everywhere. In fact, our Pima County Regional Flood Control District is really good about finding these opportunities, finding areas that have chronic nuisance flooding issues. They buy up those properties and convert them, reclaim them, especially when they're adjacent to, this is the Cañada del Oro Creek. So returning this as a floodplain center. In fact, this was actually the first permitted curb cut we did in Pima County. And we had the flood controls backing to work with the County Department of Transportation. We took water off of these neighborhood streets, and this is after a 2-inch rainfall event, I believe. So these are fairly large basins helping to restore that riparian environment. The really cool thing is now scaling this up is our county is now looking at the soils across the basin where there's increase in stormwater runoff and how we can pair those two together to find opportunities to do targeted green infrastructure for enhanced recharge of our basin or of our aquifer to make better use of that stormwater as a resource. So this is really cool. I mean, flood control comes with a lot of funding, a lot of regulatory backing. And so this is a way to take some of those small examples and start to collectively scale that up. If you're interested in learning more about green stormwater infrastructure, some of the best practices, this is for dryland communities, so it may need to get adapted a little bit for some of your area, but maybe some, food for thought for thinking about how to get started. This is a free download from our website, both in English and Spanish, and gives a range of practices from curb cuts to in-street practices to then even floodplain restoration. Now, with all of this, it's thinking about how do we come back together to work collectively to restore essentially the sponge in our community, which we've lost, is that riparian system with that intact floodplain. And also thinking about these as, we're dealing with rapidly warming communities. A large part of that, over half of that, is due to our built environment, not just from climate change. And so thinking about what we can do locally to cool our communities, and thinking about these riparian corridors have a large part to play in creating cooling corridors for us. And many of these corridors run through underserved communities. So thinking about as we restore groundwater access, as we can restore floodplain, we can store these riparian cooling systems that can help combat urban heat island issues. Some of the things that we're doing beyond just rainwater harvesting, stormwater harvesting is how do we restore these rivers? And so we kind of take the approach of how do we protect, preserve, and then how do we reclaim and restore? And everything from land to thinking about infiltration, recharge, to removal of invasive arundo, which actually evapotranspires a lot more water than native plants. But on the flip side of that is also thinking about demand reduction strategies. How do we extend out conservation incentives so we can demand less? And then how do we enhance the supply through enhanced infiltration? And then also thinking about recycled water, right? This is a huge resource. How do we best distribute it for beneficial use in our community? Does it make sense to irrigate lawns and parks? Maybe it does from a community side, but does it make sense to have as many golf courses as we do? Would that be better situated for preserving, protecting our riparian systems? And just to kind of wrap this up is thinking about where are we going? Where would I like to see Tucson go? We still have a lot of work in front of us, especially with new development. We haven't really tackled new development yet. And so many people think we're overpopulated. We have too many people that we can support. And I want to paint a little bit different of a picture in that we have the opportunity to continue to grow economically, but we need to do it in a mindful fashion. And so this is, I know it may be a little bit hard to see on the screen, but this is just kind of a case study that we did of a nearby community. We looked at conventional development, how much that would demand per year from a water budgeting perspective. So this 100, I think it was 60 homes, 50 acre feet per year. And if we start to implement low impact development strategies, green infrastructure, we could start to drop that demand a little bit. And the more invasive or the more, I guess you could say, proactive approach that we would take, we could continue to drop it by making use of that stormwater. But then eventually we found that single family residential is really hard to overcome from a water budgeting perspective to make it net zero or net positive. What we found is kind of reorienting, rethinking about how we do development, doing cluster development that then we have better controls over rooftop rainwater harvesting, gray water reuse, stormwater enhanced recharge. We can then drop that down to about 2 acre feet per year. And that's just on site. So then thinking about from a net blue perspective is, okay, we could take that 2 acre feet per year that they're demanding, and now they would pay into a conservation fund that would find that savings elsewhere in the community, knowing that a lot of our community is older homes, older development that has a lot of potential for savings. So as I wrap up, I'm a water resource manager, I'm a watershed manager, but I need to remind myself, and I'm starting to think about how do we frame this differently. We can't always be thinking about water in terms of productive units, right? So a lot of our creeks or rivers have an inherent right to water, just as humans have an inherent right to water to survive and live. And so we need to think about how can we connect to water and rivers and creeks and aquifers in a different way, not from a bean counting way, but from a spiritual, from a a place of connection. And so with that shifts our relationship from extractive, productive units to thinking about how we can foster reciprocity and stewardship of these systems. So with that, I just kind of want to leave it there of thinking about how do we shift our connection. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to share with you some of the things that we're learning here in Tucson. Hopefully some of this might be helpful for different actions that you all are taking. And I think the cross-pollination of our different communities is vitally important because I continue to learn from other communities of different approaches, different ways of thinking, and how can we infuse that back here in Tucson. So with that, I'm happy to take questions and hear from you.
I had a question. I guess I'll say it loud so everyone can hear me. I have a question about, you're trying to reduce the amount of consumption, but I wonder if we're really successful in building out this infrastructure, we might get more rainfall because some of these models are showing that if you have a lot more vegetation, a lot more trees, you actually bring more rain into the environment. So I'm wondering if you consider that even a place like Tucson could start producing more rain-fed water over the long term if we're really aggressive or really proactive in this. And if you can speak to that.
Great. Yes. Thank you for that question. That's not one I regularly get, so I appreciate thinking about that would be a great opportunity for us to actually get more rainfall and have that be as a response from increasing our urban forests. We do have a little bit of an urban heat bubble that we sometimes complain why we don't get the monsoon rains that we used to get. I think that, thinking a little bit, just scaling that out a little bit in terms of a shifting climate, what we're also seeing is that we're getting less snowfall on our mountaintops, and that is really important from a mountain front recharge and a shallow groundwater recharge benefit. And so with that, it's shifting to be more rainfall versus snow, which means a flashier hydrology. And so I think the more we can do just slowing that hydrology from the mountaintops, down the mountain fronts, down the arroyos, down the creeks, from every backyard, front yard, along our streets, I think is really important. And if that generates more rainfall, we're going to need that because forecasts are that we're going to be warmer. It's unclear yet if we're going to be drier or wetter or remain the same. But regardless, as we get warmer, that means our demand will actually go up. And with that being less snowfall, it's going to be that much harder to slow that hydrology to recharge our aquifers. So this is where we're advocating for kind of that watershed approach for slowing that hydrology and doing it each step of the way. Hopefully that gets at your question.
Okay. Is that, hear me? Okay. Okay. Yeah, my question was about your practices related to those that are trying to infiltrate stormwater or rainwater to the local groundwater. There's some sense of like if it's on their landscape on the surface, then it's in their control. But once it goes to the groundwater, it can go wherever. So I'm wondering what kind of groundwater ownership issues you normally think about when you're advising people to infiltrate. Is it something they're actually concerned about, or is it just they're glad that the water's infiltrating and they're not worried if it actually remains on their own property to retrieve later?
That's a great question. I would love for more people to be concerned where the water goes. So unfortunately, Arizona's water laws separate surface water and groundwater. So groundwater is kind of a pooled resource. So it's a shared aquifer with private pumpers, the city utility, other utilities, commercial greenhouses, everybody's pulling from that aquifer. So yes, as we infiltrate that stormwater, it is going into the aquifer. It does become part of that shared resource. However, I think where people are most interested in that potential for recharge is along our riparian areas and shallow groundwater areas. And I think what concerns them more is seeing that cottonwood die, seeing that Gooding's willow die, seeing that sycamore die because of, during a period of drought, losing access to groundwater. And that's because during our periods of drought, we're not framing them as droughts. We're just saying, oh, that's too bad. We have less rainfall, but we continue to pump the same. And so that means that those systems are becoming more and more stressed. So the opportunity for recharge with stormwater is fairly limited in our basin. Most of the Midtown residents, where most of the population lives, it's over 200 feet to get to the aquifer. Whereas in other parts of the basin along those margins, that's where it's 50 to 50 feet or less to the aquifer where we have that potential to recharge. So largely we're just saying, let's get it into the soil. It's much cheaper to store rainwater, stormwater in the soil than it is in tanks or reservoirs, for example, and let nature do that work for us. Great question. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, could you just clarify your vision for the amount of impervious surfaces? It almost sounded like you were suggesting that, you discovered new water. Essentially, there's no new water in the system. And so I'm just curious, I think I just wanted clarification on that. And then my second question was, do you know of new technologies for roads? Because it seems like, we're still building very black surfaces everywhere. And I'd be curious to see if you're trying to change that. Thanks.
Great questions. When I say new water, it's from a legal sense that it's new water. You're correct that there's no new water in the system. It's just that nobody has appropriated that water. So it's new water to us to be able to do with and think about how we want to manage it better. And I am not advocating for paving over a watershed to produce more new water. Yeah, I want to make sure that that's not the line of thinking that I'm conveying, but more of how do we make use of that water as we build out our environment and making sure we do it in a deliberate, meaningful fashion, knowing that every new roof does produce a bit more water, but how do we put that to productive use versus being a problematic a problem. From a asphalt perspective, so we are a watershed group. We largely deal with water issues. And I've been a lifelong bike commuter, bus commuter. My wife and I have actually lived the last 7 years without a car. And just this year, we realized that we really need to tackle our approach to urban land use planning and transportation planning, in that roads and the amount of land that's dedicated to the personal vehicle here in Tucson and many across our Western communities, it's 30 to 40% of roads, driveways, parking lots just for a personal vehicle to move across town. And so that's generating, well, one, a lot of asphalt that produces a lot of stormwater, and it's often very polluted stormwater. It also produces a lot of urban heat. As you were mentioning, it's a huge contributor to our urban heat problem. And so thinking about how do we reduce the asphalt extent in our built environment, and how do we create more opportunities for green infrastructure means we need road diets. And to have road diets means we need fewer personal vehicles, which means we need more bike, ped, and public transit opportunities that are safe and effective for all of our community to use. And so we've started to shift to include sustainable mobility in our programming, because it drives land use, it drives stormwater production and pollution, and it drives urban heat island. So it's a new road that we're starting to better engage on, and I advocate for all communities to think a little bit more holistically. Don't think just about the stormwater side, but think about how do our streets and our urban land use planning affect that as well. From a surface technology that you had asked the question about, there are, I believe the U of A partnered with the city of Tucson on kind of a cool surfaces approach, thinking about new technologies for asphalt to reduce that urban heat island issue, but we still have that stormwater pollution runoff that's associated with it. So yeah, we have a long ways to go on that. Great questions.
Thank you so much. This is going to be sort of a follow-up on that. I know that a lot of the work that you're doing started as a, kind of a late at night under the table kind of stuff. And how did you get it to the point, or how did you get to start working with the city of Tucson and the public officials to kind of change their thinking about that?
Oh, that's almost an origin story question. That would, how do we engage different ways? And I think it starts with, we just started meeting people where they're at. And so, sorry, I was looking at the text. Can you repeat the question? How did you get started working with officials? Okay. I think, it's when we first started, we had a grant to put in 6 demonstration sites for water harvesting, passive and active. And instead of just hiring contractors or just doing it ourselves, we engaged the community around, the neighborhoods around, to say, come help us plan and implement. And from that, we developed a groundswell of just community support that then we were able to engage at 2 of those sites were at our city ward offices. So we engaged our political elected leaders. And so that's kind of been the approach of our organization, is how do you engage the community, build that collective support, but also engage at the elected leader, the agency level, find your champions, and then have the 2 sides come together to meet in the middle for then being able to scale up. And so with a number of years, not just ourselves, but others in the community working on this, we now have an incentive program that the city offers up to $2,000 for residential rainwater harvesting. They now include commercial incentives for businesses to be able to do this. So the other thing is we had to advocate probably over 20 years for a stormwater utility or some investment at the community scale for green stormwater infrastructure. So a few years ago, they finally piloted a conservation fee that supported a green stormwater infrastructure capitalization and maintenance of existing green stormwater infrastructure. So now we have $3 to $4 million a year in funding to be able to do that. Unfortunately, we need probably 20 to 30 million a year to be able to scale that out over the next 20 years. But it's a start, and we're growing it. Great question. That's a tough one.
Hey, so I guess my question was kind of following up with what you had just mentioned about maintaining and I guess implementing infrastructure for green stormwater at the municipal level. I live in San Diego, where we are already treating and recycling wastewater, which is a painful topic. People don't want to find that one. But the problem that we see with like your urban enhanced runoff is with roofs and parking lots and streets, there is so much pollution. So it sounds like you're working with the municipality, like for implementing this. Do you guys have a model that works for treating that water before you put it back out as effluent?
Good question. I think there might be two different aspects to your question. So one is looking at the treated wastewater, treated effluent, and how do we best reuse that in our community? And the second being stormwater treatment to address pollutants that are running off of our built environment. Please correct me if.
So let me, I'm sorry, can I tie it back together? I think I kind of mixed up. Yeah. So I guess when you harvest the stormwater specifically, you would be putting it back out as effluent. So I guess my question is, do you have a model specifically for the stormwater?
So for stormwater, a lot of this is site-based practices. So thinking about stormwater harvesting and bioremediation at that site per individual basin. So whether it be a curb cut basin or a chicane or a bump out that has green stormwater infrastructure, that's our treatment mechanism. There are some communities that then take that, as it starts to collect into larger creeks or river systems, if it's highly polluted, such as, San Diego, after an atmospheric river, you have a lot of that runoff. So that's going to overwhelm any small site-based distributed green infrastructure that, which is kind of your first flush, but then you still have additional treatment needs. That's where you get into your regional infrastructure that's, creating wetlands, creating other bioremediation techniques before it gets discharged into a larger river or into the ocean. I was actually just in San Diego last weekend, and it did rain there. And I just went running, and I realized, there's a lot of opportunity in San Diego, from alleyways to driveways to road diets, for just treating locally that stormwater, but then thinking about how it runs into the larger, the canyons and such. And a lot of those canyons are eroded, have a lot of invasive plants, or are concreted over. So how do we renaturalize those and get that natural infrastructure functioning again?